Hello and good afternoon. My name is Daniela Burrell, tech writer at Fortune. It's my pleasure to be your moderator today for today's Commonwealth Club program, How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. Could there be a more important topic to discuss right now? I'm pleased to be joined by two experts to talk about this topic, which is explored in the new book edited by one of our speakers today, Jim Steyer. Jim is the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, a media advocacy organization for families and schools. This program is being held in association with Common Sense Media. Jim is the editor of the new book, Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. The book offers a collection of essays on how technology is affecting democracy, society, and our future, and it's available where books are sold. Jim is joined today by one of the contributors to the book, Frank Foer. Frank is a writer at The Atlantic and author of 2 books himself. His contribution to Jim's book is focused on the new era of deepfake videos. We will discuss that and much more here today. Before we jump into the conversation, one final note before we start. If you have a question for either Jim or Frank, please post it in the YouTube chat box or the Facebook comments section, and they'll be forwarded to me during the program. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, congrats to you both on the new book. It looks great.
Thank you.
And let's go ahead and just get started with the big picture. I wanna start on a larger level, and then we'll sort of zoom in as we get a little deeper. So when we talk about, I know we could spend an hour on this topic alone, but when we talk about the bigger issues related to these massive tech companies, in this particular moment, I'm curious to know what concerns you most about the growing power of big tech companies. And Jim, I'll let you go ahead and start on that one.
Thank you very much, Danielle and Frank. Thanks for being here, and welcome everybody. I mean, I think 2 things come to mind immediately. First of all, we're in the middle of perhaps the most important election of our lifetimes. And I'm over 40 now, so I can tell you this is a really important election in my opinion. And technology is playing a huge role in this election. And in many cases, there are people who are using it to potentially try to undermine some of our democratic norms and institutions. So just in the context of the 2020 election, technology and the role of a handful of really large tech companies is absolutely paramount. And the second thing is, as you know, I am the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, the largest kids media and advocacy group in the United States. And we have, well over 100 million unique users, and they're focused mostly on the impact of technology on their children and on their kids' education. So what we are seeing at this point is in a COVID-19 era where we're doing shows like this on a Zoom screen, our kids are going to school on a Zoom screen, and their lives are being shaped by technology and by screen information for many hours a day. So whether it's our democracy or our kids or the future of our economy, this really is a question of the existential issues facing our society, and honestly, which side of history are the big tech companies on, period.
Just to start, I wanted to just say congratulations to Jim. I mean, this book is, I think, the most comprehensive examination of tech's place in our lives, in our personal lives, in our democratic lives, in our economic lives, and it's a truly star-studded cast of contributors, and so it's a really terrific, important volume. When I think about tech, I think about in the long view. Tech is one of these things that is just an innate, essential human drive that humans produce tools to make our lives better, and so we've created tools wherever we go in whatever era, and those tools become an extension of ourselves. The hammer is an extension of the arm. The factory is an extension of upper body strength. And the tools that we've created now are primarily intellectual tools that are extensions of our brain. And the problem is that, for me, is that the companies that operate these tools, that control these intellectual processes, operate in an invisible way where we're not really fully aware of all of the forces that they exert on us. And so they have tremendous powers to manipulate human beings, that they sell it as kind of making our lives easier because they alleviate us of the burden of choice. So when it comes to picking a restaurant or charting a route to get from point A to point B, we really appreciate that. But when it comes to something like structuring democratic conversation or structuring a marketplace, the invisible power that they exert becomes anti-democratic. And so when I think about the big tech companies and their role in our lives, I worry about how they're shaping not just everyday life, and not just even shaping government and policy and marketplaces, but how they are visibly and profoundly affecting the course of the species, because we're merging with these machines. And they talk about the day when Google gets implanted in your brain, and we're already wearing them on our wrists, and if Google Glass and augmented reality is something we wear in the bridge of your nose. But the day when we merge with these machines in a more profound sort of way is just around the corner. And unless we set up the right sorts of rules and frameworks, we're not just giving ourselves over to machines, we're giving ourselves over to the companies that run and control those machines.
That's a great way to explain that, Frank. And I know I actually have some questions further down the way that talks directly at this, and specifically about your chapter, which kind of discusses this in a more profound way. I want to quickly just touch on something, given the moment we're in. I know that since the 2016 presidential election, we've learned a lot about the role technologies have played in our democracy. I mean, we've learned a lot since then. A lot has come out, and we're still learning, I think. And what we've seen is a little bit of two things, right? We've seen further division of our country. That's happening within politics on its own, but obviously we're seeing it sort of amplified through technology. And then we're also seeing these companies desperately try to curtail some of this, how well they're doing, But I am curious on both of your opinions. Do you think it's getting any better? If we're to look at 2016 versus where we are now, have we gotten any better?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. So in 2016, it's clear that probably the single biggest foreign adversary we have, Russia, manipulated our election on behalf of one of the candidates. That's an absolute disgrace. Imagine if we had said in 2015, or when we were in high school or college, that our biggest international adversary would manipulate our election with the acquiescence of one of the two major candidates for president. That's mind-boggling. But more importantly, with the knowledge of and the acquiescence of one of the major companies in America, Facebook. But that's exactly what happened in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And by the way, that continues to happen to this day. The second thing that happens, and again, I'm going to point the finger significantly at Facebook and Instagram, because they've been the platform most of all that have done this. They've also spread division. When you've looked at the formation of white supremacy groups and militia groups, and just this morning, and a plot to assassinate the governor of Michigan by some white supremacist militia crazies in Michigan, where do you think they form? On Facebook. So I think that in some ways, it was worse in 2016 because we didn't know about it. But in 2020, we know about it, and some of the companies are doing nothing about it, or they're paying lip service to it. So, and by the way, they're profiting massively at the same time from people who are trying to use those platforms for misinformation, disinformation, and as you mentioned, Danielle, division. So it's a really interesting moment. And the companies themselves bear enormous responsibility, as do the politicians who, in some cases, have actually encouraged them to sow mistrust and misinformation. But from a democratic norm standpoint, this is unprecedented. And it's a clarion call to all of us, no matter what our political perspectives, to be involved. I don't know, Frank, what do you think?
I think that at a micro level, there's certain things that they're doing well now. Like when it comes to Russian interference, I think that if Facebook or Twitter or the tech companies see some sign of it, they're going to jump on that problem because they don't want to be tagged in the same sort of way that they were in 2017. But I think a lot of what they do just kind of points to the even bigger problem. Like, so you take Facebook's decision about QAnon the other day.
Right.
On the one hand, I'm kind of grateful for that Facebook is taking action here, right? And that they're doing something to try to tamp down on the conspiracies that spread through their machines. On the other hand, you've got to say there's so much power invested in these companies, so that they are then regulating the public square in unprecedented sorts of ways. And who decides what's a conspiracy and what's not a conspiracy? Well, a couple people, and who were not democratically elected, who have an extreme profit interest. But I think the biggest problem, so that's one big problem, is the concentration of power. The other big problem is that they've broken the world in a way in which we're not going to be able to quickly repair it, which is that they've destroyed authoritative institutions that were the guardians of truth. And so media and our institutions are so distrusted in the world. There's a reason that conspiracy flourishes, and it's not just that it's disseminated via Facebook, it's that Facebook broke the institutions that were actually the primary byways of truth to the public.
That's a sound point, Danielle.
Yeah.
Right.
I actually, totally agree. We do talk about, I think it's a mixture, right, of politics and tech, sort of destroying the trust in the institutions we're used to trusting. So great point. And it's actually a really important segue to what I actually was going to ask next, which is, all of this has already happened, right? People already are sort of down the rabbit hole, genie's out of the bottle. These groups are forming and they're going to continue to form. I think, right, like Facebook has already openly admitted it's sort of like an arms race, right, to stay ahead of this, which I don't know if you can stay ahead of it. I'm curious, what do we do now? Like, these technologies exist. They're going to continue to exist in some form. I think we could be as idealistic as we want to be here, but we can't just say, okay, everybody throw out your laptop. What do we do now?
Three things, very simple. And I think you're starting to see this happen. And I'm proud to say I run the most important advocacy group in the United States, if not globally, that's actually done several of these things. First and foremost, they've operated in a completely deregulated environment for the past 15 years. It's been a joke. So the political leadership in America, particularly in Washington, D.C., abdicated their responsibility and allowed this, what Frank and I just described and you've described, Danielle, happened in a vacuum with the complete and utter pathetic behavior of Washington, D.C. on both sides of the aisle. They failed to regulate anything, even though our public square was literally being turned upside down and many of our democratic norms and economic norms were. So number one, you can do what we did in California, which is we passed the landmark California Consumer Privacy Act, the first privacy law in the United States in 20 years, in 2018, which is now the law of the land. So that's an example of how we have to have government regulation. And depending on the electoral result in less than a month, you're going to have a chance to, basically the California privacy law is the law of the land now for everybody because we passed it here and all the companies are here. And along with GDPR in Europe, you now have a privacy regime that all companies really have to follow. But you need a federal privacy law. But you also need platform accountability laws, which we can talk about. So the idea that the tech companies are not treated like publishers. Danielle, you work for a publisher. And so do I, by the way. Common Sense Media is a publisher with hundreds of millions of users. I am responsible for what's on my platform, and so is the editor-in-chief of Fortune magazine, right? And Fortune Digital. So you're going to have to see, number one, a clear set of regulatory structures because the companies themselves have proven incapable of self-regulation. Second, you're going to have to hold the companies accountable for their errors, both through regulatory structures, but also public shaming. So for example, we've done a campaign over the last couple months aimed at Facebook called Stop Hate for Profit that led to a month-long advertising boycott by many of the largest advertisers in the world of that platform. You're going to have to see, therefore, pressure at the corporate level because there's been such an accumulation of power in a small handful of hands, as Frank mentioned. But the third thing is the public is just going to have to step up and play their role. And I think we're starting to see that. You've really seen that in this election, much more than in 2016 or even 2018. So the public has to become more aware of the impact of tech on our society, call for thoughtful, common sense regulation. But there's a role for government, there's a role for corporate responsibility, and then there's a role for every single person in the audience to hold this situation accountable and get us to the place we want to be. Those are the three things I'd say need to happen. Frank.
I think it's interesting to just situate ourselves in the pandemic where everything, all the problems of society get have become exaggerated and in some ways easier to see. And so you see the way in which a lot of formerly public responsibilities have become invested in private actors. And government has failed in so many ways over the course of this pandemic that Amazon or Google becomes an institution in which the public actually has greater faith than in a lot of ways in their own government. And I think that that needs to be reversed. And so I think that there needs to be a reinvigoration of government and a restoration of faith in public institutions. I think that there needs to be, I think that David Cicilline's report that came out just the other day is one of the most significant documents produced by government in a very long time, by the Congress in a very long time. And if it hadn't been published, 29 days out from a presidential election, it would have been all over the front pages. But I think it provides a blueprint for what the next administration could do with big tech, which is that there's going to be some form of breakup, of at least some of these companies. And it's something that we don't need to fear. It's something that we should welcome. And I think it will actually produce greater innovation. And I think it'll be healthy for the democracy. But I also just want to amplify something that you said, Jim, which is that there is, I think we need to actually, in the whole paradigm, change the way that we individually act. That that what needs to happen is we've been passive consumers in this whole big scheme. And what I think you promote at Common Sense Media, and what I wholeheartedly embrace, is that there's a need for us to behave more actively as citizens and also to exert greater control over technology's role in our own lives, that we need to be countercultural about this. And you see it happening. But that's one of the things that unfortunately this pandemic is kind of thrust upon us, is that we are so utterly dependent on technology. And thank goodness for Zoom and Teams and WebEx and all these technologies that allow life to continue. But on the other hand, we also see how tiring it is to live a life on screens, and how a life on screens, as beneficent and wonderful as it is to have these tools, we can't allow it to become the sum total of life, and that requires us to exert greater control.
I agree. To pick up on one thing that Frank just said, Danielle. So I'm a Stanford professor. I've been a Stanford professor for more than 30 years, and I have a class right now on Election 2000 with nearly 2,000 students taking it on Zoom. It's really interesting. By the way, it's not the same as being in front of a live audience of 1,000 kids. It's 2,000 people on a Zoom screen. So this past Monday night, my guests were John Hennessy, the former president of Stanford, who's the board chair of Google, and Kara Swisher, the well-known tech journalist, and Nate Persley, Stanford law professor, is the #1 expert on technology and election. So Kara, who is thoughtful and outspoken at the top of the list, in my opinion, said that John Hennessy, the chair of Google and Alphabet, John, this is to Frank's point, you are going to be broken up. Google is going to be broken up. Why don't you face the facts now? It's going to be good for you, by the way. You're going to actually be even more valuable at the end of the day. But it was really an interesting moment. She said it in front of 2,000 Stanford students, said, John, you're the board chair. You used to run this university. Why don't you face the facts? We are going to break you up. You should be broken up. Facebook should be broken up and forced to divest itself of WhatsApp and Instagram. This is going to happen. Why don't you take the lead and do it on your own? I thought it was one of the most interesting, and John Hennessy had a really interesting, smiled and laughed and said, there may be the truth, but I agree. So Congressman Cicilline's report, which Frank referred to, is the first time that we've even dealt with some of the concentration of power issues, and the fact that in an unprecedented way in our lifetimes, and I think in American history, a small handful of companies have achieved a level of impact and dominance on our lives and on our institutions, unprecedented American history. So how we address this will determine which side of history we're all on.
Danielle, can I add one thing to it?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Jim just said I think that in terms of appreciating the stakes, and I think the book does an excellent job of this, is that what's at stake is actually almost spiritual, right?
Right.
Um, it's that it's about maintaining autonomy, but it's also protecting. It's about protecting communities and preserving institutions, like, just at the most basic level. Like, we've seen the way in which dependence on technology comes to interfere with familial life, right? Like the way in which it kind of draws us apart, even when we're residing in the same physical spaces. And that to protect these things that we really care about, and once they're gone, they're gone. Like we need to we can't kind of dance around the ultimate stakes. And I just, again, a pandemic example. I strolled down my main street in Washington, and I see all the stores gone. I see all the Amazon packages mount up, and like on some level, it is a zero-sum game, right? And we all know that in our core. And I want to have, my life is richer if I have stores, if I have a local marketplace that I can touch, where I have serendipitous interactions with people who don't look like me, with their vendors who actually care about, about what the street looks like, and are trying to improve that. And I think as we think about economic structure going into this next administration, I think we need to think about some of these core values as we remake things.
Yeah, and you all actually dove right into what I wanted to talk about next, which is regulation.
Yeah.
Obviously, you touched on antitrust, which I want to get into, but I want to ask specifically because Jim, I know that you have a particular stance on this. I
Right.
want to touch, and it does sort of cover everything we've been talking about. I want to touch Section 230.
Sure.
And I know that's a real controversial thing right now. For those who don't know, what Section 230 basically does is it allows tech companies from being held liable. It doesn't leave them liable to what their users post. So if I post something, it's not Facebook's fault.
Right.
So that's the way Section 230 is benefiting tech companies. But Jim, I think you actually are not a fan of Section 230. So let's talk a little bit about that.
So in fact, in the book, I wrote a piece about Section 230 with my colleague and a good friend, Bruce Reed, who Frank knows well, who's Chief Domestic Policy Advisor for Clinton Obama. He's Vice President Biden's Chief of Staff. Very, very knowledgeable. And we basically said how Section 230 hurts kids, because what you just explained, Danielle, is right. Section 230 here's what people need to understand. It was written in 1996 when Mark Zuckerberg was in diapers, right? When Google was just, and Larry and Sergey were in high school. Guys, that's that they set this law. Basically, the purpose of Section 230 was to prevent certain kinds of pornography and other stuff on the internet, but also it had nothing to do with what it immunized. It was designed to protect the internet from bad behavior, and it immunized tech companies and didn't treat them as publishers. It treated them as utilities. But the whole thing is it gave them immunity for what's ever on their platform. Unlike, by the way, what Fortune or ABC, NBC, Comcast, a print, radio, TV publication has. They're responsible for what's on their platform as publisher. So, and no one's done anything about it in 24 years. And I've been going to various senators since once we made the breakthrough on privacy. So I want to talk about privacy. I'm sure we'll talk about privacy as well. But once we made the landmark breakthrough by passing the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is the law of the land in America, you realize you could regulate over the objection of some of the largest tech companies in the world who all happen to be based in California. You could see that we could do this. So we have been calling for the last 2 to 3 years for the reimagining Section 230. So here's the deal. You need to be held, at the simplest level, I would say this. We should treat the large tech platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, the same way we treat large television, cable, radio, and print outlets. You should have standards and practices for the content on your platform. You should have teams who control that, even if it's user-generated content. If you do not adhere to those standards, you should be punished for that. You should be held liable for that. It's a fairly simple construct since it's how we operate in all aspects of our society. That said, I am a law professor at Stanford. I teach First Amendment law. I am well aware of the fact that you do not want to have a position where government is regulating speech per se. But there is a very positive way to completely overhaul Section 230. I have a piece with Bruce in the book called Why Section 230 is Bad for Kids and How We Can Change It. And by the way, I think we will change it in 2021. It just requires a change of regime in Washington because Congress, and by the way, Donald Trump yesterday, I believe, tweeted repeal Section 230. So you have people on both sides of the political aisle saying this. Josh Hawley and some of the other most conservative senators in the country are calling for either repeal or complete overhaul of Section 230 as well. They claim that media tech companies are biased against them. I think that's complete baloney. That said, this is going to lead for a massive overhaul, but that should have happened a decade ago, by the way. This was all preventable. But they do not deserve immunity any more than Fortune deserves immunity if you published hate speech and violent stuff on a Fortune platform. So there's a happy medium here, but smart people on both sides are going to have to come together and recraft a legislative regulatory structure in 2021. And we're going to need a competent, functioning Federal Communications Commission too, to enforce those laws. But I'm optimistic that you're going to see Section 230, massive change. I think you'll see privacy even stronger than the California law. And then I think you are going to see antitrust. So the era of finally regulating the tech industry with common sense, thoughtful protections that benefit the public and our democratic norms and institutions, that is just around the corner. You agree, Frank?
I do. And I think that, we need to dispense with some of the kind of the original Aaron Swartz type dreams about the way that the internet functions, because we know that it's already, power is concentrated, that there is no true free speech on the platforms is only partially true, that it's the platform that governs the rules. And rather than have an unaccountable corporation setting the rules, what we need to have is a set of public-minded standards so that there is some form of democratic accountability to the way that public square is structured.
And I want to challenge you, because I know there's a lot of people probably watching this and saying, both on Section 230 and on antitrust, if we break the companies away, if we put all these new regulations, it's not going to be the same. I'm not going to get to go on Facebook and say my opinions. There's a lot of people who already believe that Facebook and Twitter are covering up things unfairly, hiding things unfairly, enforcing policies unfairly. And then there are a lot of people who are also concerned about the breaking up of big tech and what that could cause for possible security and possible just ability to use the services we have today. I'm curious as to both of your answers to that kind of pushback.
Well, I think you're going to have a robust public discussion, and I think you're going to need, pardon the phraseology, a common sense solution to this. You're going to have some of the most thoughtful people in this country with looking at the long-term best interests of of the society and these platforms. It's simply not true that you're not going to be able to put up your own opinion on stuff. That's not true. But there may be limitations on whether or not you can spew forth hate speech and certain forms of violent content that would violate any First Amendment norms under existing law that cover all the other platforms and expression platforms in this country. So many of those fears are unfounded. Part of it is we haven't had this discussion, Danielle, until very recently. I mean, the fact that you're using the term Section 230 is ironic to me. I'm being serious, meaning we've been railing about this issue, and I've been railing about privacy since I wrote Talking Back to Facebook in 2012. But 2 years ago, if we had said Section 230, nobody knows what you're talking about. That could be a part of the supermarket where you get the meat counter. So it's only in the last 6 months that the public has started, and the policymakers have started to understand that we actually have no regulation. But I'm very optimistic that a thought, if you have leadership, and by the way, it's going to require national leadership, but if we have thoughtful, common sense national leadership, I believe we can address all of these regulatory ways in a way that's going to benefit everybody and allow for a diversity of public discourse and civic discourse and a broad variety of opinions, but in a way that's much healthier for our democracy. Do you agree, Frank? I mean,
I think the way I think about it is that I have faith in our ability to create democratic standards and to create more democratic structures. But I also have faith in the market and in the company's ability to innovate our way out of these problems. But I don't think that they're going to innovate their way out of these problems unless there is significant public pressure on them to change. And so once you start to, I mean, I look at Microsoft and how Microsoft evolved in response to the government's antitrust case in the late 1990s. And I think that that was one of the most underrated episodes in American political economy, that Microsoft was a company that behaved incredibly badly. And when they worried about the government breaking it up, they started to behave more responsibly as it relates to consumers. And I think in aggregate, they started to behave like a more mature, publicly minded company that was less abusive of the power that it has. And, I just look back over the course of American history, and what you see is you have a series of communication monopolies, and what the government does very successfully is it prevents those monopolies from extending themselves into the next realm so that they can't control the next new thing. So, you have the post office, the first communications monopoly, and the government said, no, you can't get into the telegraph business. And so you have Western Union come in and with some government help, they established a monopoly in the telegraph business, but they worried that Ulysses S. Grant was going to nationalize the telegraph business. And so they were restrained when it came to the telephone business. And then you had AT&T, of course, which operated under pretty massive constraints from the government, and the government prevented them from getting into the radio business and so on and so forth. And I think that that's really what we need ultimately government to do in the biggest picture, which is to allow space for the next set of innovators to come around and produce the technology that does have better security than we're getting now, but better privacy protections, a more responsible way of curating the public square than the Facebook model.
I agree. And I will tell you, Danielle, that since I have to work with the people who run all the tech companies, and whether they like it or not, they respond to common sense and us. I see a difference in leadership in some of the companies, for example. I mean, Google, which it's obviously one of the massive companies we're talking about here. I would tell you that the leadership at Google now under Sundar Pichai and John Hennessy, the board chair, and the new leadership there over the last couple of years has a much better sense of the public interest. They've been very important. By the way, they have a huge dominant role in education in the United States, whether our audience knows that or not. Basically, most teachers in the United States, particularly in a distance learning environment, are using Google Classroom. So it's hard to express the degree to which Google, and just one example, reaches into so many aspects of our lives. People think about it as search, but they dominate education. They are by far the most important company. Yeah, but I'm optimistic that with a thoughtful regulatory structure on top of it, that Sundar and the people who run Google will see that as a public good and really invest in that in a positive way. I'd say similarly, you mentioned Zoom. So Eric Yuan, who's the CEO of Zoom, which is suddenly, you never heard of Zoom a year ago. Now everybody knows who Zoom is. And Eric, an immigrant from China, is a very, very successful businessman. Look, we know them well because they're part of a platform we built called Wide Open School. So is Google. And they had big privacy issues, as you may recall. When Zoom burst onto the scene, they had huge privacy problems. And we worked directly with Eric and the people who run the company, because we're the #1 consumer privacy group in the country, to help them address that issue. So I am optimistic that with a good framework about public interest-oriented regulation, coupled with more enlightened leadership from some of the companies, we're going to get progress. We keep calling out Facebook, I think, because they, more than any other company, and I actually think it's the leadership, and the structure, governance structure of that company, where one person has singular control of all decision. I think they're the one that are the most troubling so far. But, philanthropically, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, have actually been very thoughtful. So perhaps perhaps they're going to come around too, but I think they're going to have to be hammered big time before that really happens.
Danielle, can I add one last point?
Yeah, if you could be brief, I want to get actually Frank to your chapter. So
it's okay. This is just a warning, and I'll be really quick about it, which is that I think the danger is that if we create a regulatory structure where we manage to concentrate corporate power and create an alliance with government where their power is in turn protected by a regulatory apparatus.
You're right.
Like we end up going in a Chinese sort of direction where that symbiotic relationship becomes an exploitative one.
I agree.
Gotcha. Well, I'm going to quickly I want to get to your chapter, Frank, but I just want to mention that we do have some questions coming in from our audience. So I want to leave some time for that.
Great.
But I think it's really important we talk about your chapter, given sort of where we're headed. So for everybody watching or listening, Frank did write a chapter in Jim's book about deep fakes. And I really want to read just this quote because it's quite troubling. So with everything we've talked about, the misinformation, all the problems, he says, soon this may seem like an age of innocence. We'll shortly live in a world where our eyes routinely deceive us. Put differently, we're not so far from the collapse of reality. And he's talking about, obviously, the dissemination and popularization of deepfakes, which we've already seen some really interesting ones come up. Luckily, we haven't seen that completely take over our lives yet, but we're not far from. We're seeing manipulated videos already play a role in this election. Leading up to this election, we've seen several edited videos to make it appear as something had happened or make it appear as something, whether the time was slowed down or sleepy Joe Biden, that was a video we saw that was manipulated. I'm curious, Frank, could you tell us in your thoughts, how far are we away from convincing deep fakes sort of causing this real societal damage you're talking about?
Well, I think it does connect to everything we were talking about at the beginning about distrust of authority and how we don't know, not so long ago, if you look at the last couple of presidential elections, there's been some piece of visual evidence that's played a decisive role in shaping the narrative of the election, if not the outcome. So you like the Mitt Romney 47% video, like the Access Hollywood video. And there's something about in a world where we don't, people don't trust media so much anymore. There's something about the verisimilitude of those videos, the raw, authentic nature of them that causes people to really trust them. Or if you look at something like the George Floyd tape or any other, the Philando Castro tape, those recorded instances of police brutality have been so profoundly important to mobilizing public opinion and creating a sea change. And so I worry that that one last thing that we can kind of all agree upon will suddenly disappear, and that there will be nothing that will be capable of rallying the public to believe that something happened. And so if we can no longer, I don't think we're that far away really to creating totally convincing deep fake videos. I mean, I think we're on the cusp of that. If one of these big companies had some commercial interest in producing it, they could make it happen, I think, relatively quickly. But we're completely unprepared for it. Like everything else we're talking about, there's no thoughtful structure for dealing with the problem. And so once our idea of shared reality kind of fully starts to collapse, I mean, I really do think it challenges the very foundations of democratic discourse? How do we then agree on anything? How do we, if we can't agree on what's real, then the ability
Which is
to
sort
have
of already what we're having a problem with, right? Agreeing
Absolutely.
which reality, everybody has a different reality depending on what
Right.
what they're either watching, reading, or even just seeing on their own, in their own vacuum, so to speak.
That's absolutely right. And so,
But the Section 230 issue will matter. To some extent, Frank's piece there about deepfakes, a more robust regulatory scheme would allow you to go after platforms that enable deepfakes on the platform. There's absolutely a liability structure that could be for both regulatory purposes, but also individual liability. If you were able to sue, if Nancy, like the deepfake involved in Frank's piece was about Nancy Pelosi, a deepfake video of Nancy Pelosi, as I recall. And so if Nancy Pelosi had the right to sue Facebook for that, I'm sorry, you have a huge liability issue there, and the companies will clean the act up. That's the marketplace working. It's one of the, there are also individual legal ways to go after this and to return to a much more normal regime, but we have to have a regulatory structure in place for that.
I gotcha. Okay, well, I want to get to a couple of quick audience questions before we get some closing thoughts, because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of closing thoughts. But I'm just going to go down the list as they came in. Our first question is, why does more propaganda from Russians matter when torrents come from everywhere, including from political parties and independents? I don't know if anybody has
I've written a lot about Russia and Russia manipulation. And, you know, I think what Russia has done is, in almost every regard, is exploit something pre-existing. So they're exploiting like pre-existing American polarization, and they're exploiting the platforms. They understood the weaknesses of Facebook, and in some ways they were using it in a way in which it was designed at its core. If Facebook is a manipulation machine where the platform is trying to manipulate its users into spending as much time on the platform as possible by riling their emotions. I mean, the Russians were using it as intended. I think that, I think it's okay to establish a hierarchy of things that we care about. And kind of at the outer end of things that we should all agree is completely unacceptable is for a foreign government to come into our country and try to manipulate the political ecosystem in order to undermine the foundations of democracy. So I think, while Trump does a lot of horrible things, I think in the scheme of things, at least we should all be able to agree that that the Russian interference is out of bounds. Unfortunately, because of the president, we're not able to agree that Russian interference is out of bounds.
I mean, Danielle, I think that's an act of war. I actually think it's an act of warfare by a foreign adversary, and we would normally respond if it weren't for the leadership of our country and the fact that they were benefiting, they perceived themselves to be benefiting and have a unique, and who wants to explain this relationship? I don't. But that's an act of warfare against our country. And in normal times and under normal leadership, we would have responded as if it's an act of warfare, period. That's very different when a foreign government adversary goes after us like that.
And then another question has come in. It looks like, I'm assuming this is about content moderation, but apologies, I'm not fully sure. Why so much focus on nationalists, including the tiny few fanatics there, when far left fanatics attacking them are ignored?
I mean, ideally, if you're creating rules for the internet, they would be politically and ideologically agnostic, and we'd be able to establish kind of what is out of bounds because it's a distortion of truth that is somehow harmful to the common good or to the democratic good in a way that we achieve. I do think that it's hard to establish any sort of equivalence right now, just given the level of right-wing conspiratorial thinking. I mean, it's just that you have a president who won't condemn QAnon and that has festered in the way that it has. I mean, I can't sit here and say, oh, it's all it's all the same. It's all happening in equal ways across the political spectrum, because it's not.
I agree with Frank, but we should have agnostic rules. But you've seen they're just you've seen white supremacy groups and others much more active, and conspiracy groups much more active. But yes, it should cut across the board. The regulation should apply equally to everybody.
And this next question, again, also on content moderation, related to the last question. And Jim, I think you actually already kind of started to talk about this a little bit. And it's the concern about who decides what is true or not, right? And I don't know in the future, this person is just asking, like, who decides what's true or not? And you know, especially if they're non-violent messages where it's, you know, unclear. And I think you had also mentioned a little bit about regulation and possible rules, but you still get into this gray area, right? Of, you know, what is true and what is not, and what is the line of like a half truth? Is that fair? Let's explore that a little bit.
My reaction is that really, when it comes to the company, the platforms we're talking about, this is an issue for their corporate responsibility. In the same way that I am the CEO of a very large platform that will have tens of million users on it today. And I'm responsible for what's on that platform. So Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg et al. Are responsible for what's on the Facebook and Instagram platforms, period. I think when you get into government determining what's true or not, you're really down a slippery slope that I don't think works under the First Amendment. But I think that all companies should, particularly have the responsibility to moderate what's on their platforms. And by the way, they are coining money. They are trillion-dollar corporations. They have the ability to do moderation. And by the way, will there be some controversial decisions? Yes, but with big bucks and big power comes big responsibility. But this is something that all the platforms need to be responsible for and held responsible for. But I don't think you're going to get government in the business of determining what's true or not. But having said it, for all other publishing in the 21st and 20th centuries, we've had a very competent regime that's worked very well for broadcast and cable television, for radio, for print, and you can basically extrapolate from that and do that for social media and the internet as well. So I'm confident that we can do that in a thoughtful and common sense way. But there's a ton of responsibility on these trillion-dollar companies to do their job. And in some cases, they simply haven't done that.
I think one reason I'm kind of an antitrust purist is that if you create greater competition and you create a more decentralized world, then what one social media platform does, doesn't necessarily shape discourse across all platforms. So if you know what may be acceptable in Reddit is not necessarily acceptable on Facebook, and you're creating different ecosystems where people have different comfort levels about the way in which the platform is governed. But I think ultimately it is a lot of power to concentrate in the hands of these corporations. And, you know, I think you're right that we have created regimes in the past that show that it's possible to impose certain rules that require these companies to act more in the common good. But I think that these mediums are also very different than broadcast mediums, and it's harder to create those rules. I mean, the nature of a democratic social media environment is that people will say stupid things and they'll say hyperbolic things and they'll promote theories like about the world that are palpably untrue, and we can't stop that, and nor should we want us to tamp that down entirely. But I think that there are certain things that do cross limits that become untenable for democratic society. And, you know, deep fakes, I think, is a good example of that, where, you know, there's maybe not an entirely bright line, but a line that we could establish, and it's important to establish.
Our next question from the audience, why is the call for restrictions and even censorship, now particularly over electronic communication, coming from factions formerly most concerned about restrictions and censorship?
I mean, I think I think it's a fair point. I mean, I think if I interpret the question, it's, you know, you could have been a card-carrying member of the ACLU yesterday, and now you're suddenly calling for these private corporations to tamp down on speech. And I do think that there is, some level probably of inconsistency there in terms of our values. And I think that I think we do live in an era where speech is under assault from many different directions, whether it's workplaces where if I have a tattoo or I wear a t-shirt, I could get fired from my job. Or if I post something on social media that my employer doesn't like, I could get fired from my job. And I think that we need to be extremely conscious of preserving and protecting speech.
I agree.
Writ large.
Our motto is sanity, not censorship. I have common sense.
Very good, very good. Frank, this next one looks like it's maybe geared towards you. What is the latest you've heard about verification of videos with blockchain or similar tech to protect from deep fakes?
So I would be masquerading if I pretended like I was an expert on blockchain or various technological solutions for these things. But I kind of pray that these things get innovated and that they exist, and that there are ways for corporations to leverage their ingenuity to create systems that root these things out and that create clearer determinations. I mean, what's wonderful is I don't really believe that this is possible, but to have the kind of algorithmic or blockchain adjudicator of of what's real or what's not real is kind of a dream. I think that ultimately some of these cases are actually pretty tough calls that are arbitrary and require human judgment, because there are deep fake parodies, right? That should be protected speech, that we shouldn't want to see stamped out. And so, would a blockchain, it might be sensitive enough to kind of root out the example so that it gets kicked up to a board of human beings that can then adjudicate the trickier cases.
And then another deep fake question. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this one. It's pretty specific. Is the national security apparatus involved in the safeguarding against deep fakes? Do you know anything about that, Frank?
I mean, I can comment broadly on what I think that the national security apparatus is involved in, and I think that after the 2016 election, there was greater cooperation between the tech companies and the FBI and the NSA, and it was very slow in developing, but it's developed, and I think that there's a lot of communication back and forth, and it's really necessary for the tech companies because the NSA or the CIA or FBI could come across attempts by the Iranians or the Russians or the Chinese to manipulate the platforms, and that human intelligence is always going to be more useful than what the investigators on the platforms, so the algorithms on the platforms, are going to be able to root out themselves. We need that cooperation ultimately to keep the platforms a step ahead.
Got it. And then this one's a more general question. I'm going to ask this last question before we get our closing question, which will sort of help wrap up the whole thing. This is an audience question again. Do some political factions today want all opposition silenced on media? And this sounds like it's your opinion on what you think here. So.
Well, they may, but it shouldn't happen. That'd be my reaction. There may be some people who believe that, but we have extraordinary traditions of free speech and democracy in our country. Some of them have been under assault, but that shouldn't be the case. And I hope that wisdom and common sense will prevail. That's my reaction to that, Frank.
One of my favorite pieces of writing is John Milton's Areopagitica, which was a tract that John Milton, Paradise Lost, epic poet, original Enlightenment thinker, wrote about the virtues of of speech, and how ultimately, like, we do need to be tested by things that we can't stand, and that I do worry that as a society, whether it's because of filter bubbles or because of kind of a culture that favors orthodoxy, we cease to be exposed to those things that we find disagreeable. That's not to say that we can't set limits about disagreeable speech, because some speech does cross lines, and I think it's okay to create communities where there are boundaries for what's acceptable and what's unacceptable speech. But I think that the nature of democratic society, the nature of a political society, is that sometimes you have to accept that your position's not the winning position. You have to accept that that there are people who you coexist with, who hold opinions that you find, despicable. I mean, it's just how we get along.
Great. And I do want to end with one question that allows you guys to sort of think through the answer a little bit. It's a lot more broad and wrap up sort of what we've been talking about today. I'm curious as to how you think technology's impact will change in the upcoming years, how you see that broadening. Do you see more? Are we headed in a good direction? Should we be concerned? What do you see changing in upcoming years, and sort of related to these broader issues?
Frank, you want to go first, then I'll close?
Yeah, I'll be fast. I think that there's a sense of inevitability that we usually have about technology, that there's these iron laws, these trajectories that we go along, and that there's this destiny that technology carries us along. But I think a lot of what we're talking about is retaining a sense of human and democratic agency in the face of that. And so as we rush forward into the future, I think it's actually important not to rush. I think it's important to ask questions about things. Like, you take something like facial recognition software, we can't just necessarily assume that it's a good that will work out rules for eventually, that will keep the thing constrained. I think that there may be moments where we need to get the structures in place before the technology actually arrives. Otherwise, it's just going to be abused forever. And so everything that we're talking about today is about creating structures and rules so that technology serves human purposes.
I'm pretty optimistic in the long run, Danielle, because I think we have a very resilient society and a resilient democracy. And I think we need a healthy balance that in our society that protects the long-term interests of kids, families, and our democracy. And tech companies have a huge role and part to play in this. And I believe that they will do that if we keep the pressure up on them. I think government clearly has a role to play to step in and regulate. And I think they can stop being missing in action with a good election result in less than a month, and that will lead to very positive long-term changes. Look, these are existential challenges, but I think we're, as a society, strong enough to meet them. The vast majority of Americans would like to see a thoughtful, carefully moderated media and tech environment that permits free expression, but balances it with other important societal values and norms, including the best interests of our kids. And to me, that balance has been missing until very recently, but I'm optimistic it's going to come, and that we can change it, that we as citizens and as people ourselves are going to change it. Because ultimately, it's up to all of us, and consumers, parents, young people, educators, technology leaders. And at the end of the day, we all want the tech industry and ourselves to be on the right side of history. And it's time that we were on the right side of history, and I think we will be. So that's my final remark.
Well, that's a great way to wrap up. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's program. Once again, I want to thank the Commonwealth Club and Common Sense Media for putting this program together. Thanks again to Jim Steyer and Common Sense Media for the new book, Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping democracy, and our lives. And thanks to Frank for your expertise and for being
Thanks,
here as
Danielle.
well. The club will soon be posting this video on its website, www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Daniela Brill of Fortune Magazine, and this Commonwealth Club program has now concluded.